Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Richard Newcomb, and I'm a principal investigator in the Alan Wilson Centre. As I'm sure many of you already know, the Alan Wilson Centre is a network of over 100 researchers at 5 universities and 2 Crown Research Institutes around New Zealand, all undertaking research into our nation's biodiversity, particularly the evolution of animals, plants, humans and disease. Alan Wilson, after whom our centre is named, was one of New Zealand's greatest scientists, the man who proposed the out of Africa hypothesis for human origins. Using the latest genetic tools combined with mathematical analyses, Alan and his co-workers showed that we all share an African ancestor who lived less than 200,000 years ago, the so-called mitochondrial Eve. Many of you will be familiar with these ideas, which after initial skepticism and indeed downright disbelief, are all but universally accepted today. This research changed the way we think of ourselves as humans, but in many ways, Alan's work solved only a small part of the puzzle of our evolutionary history. One of the problems that has bedeviled evolutionary thinkers ever since Darwin was why humans, and indeed other animals, appear to help each other. In other words, why do we observe goodness? Today's speaker, Dugatkin, is one of the world's leading experts on the evolution of behaviour. He is currently Professor of Biology and Distinguished University Scholar at the University of Louisville in Kentucky, USA. In addition to publishing over 150 papers in prestigious journals, including Nature and the Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences, USA, Professor Dugatkin has found time to write 8 books and speak to audiences at more than 80 universities around the world. His work has been the subject of articles in many of the world's greatest newspapers, from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post to The Guardian, Toronto Globe. Tonight, Lee ends his lecture tour of New Zealand, so we're a bit sad to see him go, bringing us up to date with the latest ideas on the apparent paradox of altruism. I'm pleased to acknowledge the support of the Auckland Museum Institute. So, with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Lee to deliver his lecture, The Evolution of Goodness.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate everybody coming out tonight to take the time to listen to this. I mean, what an astonishing venue to give a talk in. I mean, the view is beautiful, and I'm going to spend my last 4 hours tomorrow going through the museum and seeing all the wonders that you've got here. As you heard, tomorrow I head back, and I'm a little sad about that. I mean, I've had the most incredible time here. For 12 days, we've had the chance to visit and to talk to people in every place from Dunedin to Christchurch, Wellington, Nelson, and Tauranga, and now here. And all of the people have just been wonderful. And I need to tell you, you know, you live in a special place, because it is not easy most of the time to get 300 or 400 people out to come and listen to a science talk. In the US, it's very difficult. Here, people seem to have a passion for it, and it's just a real thrill for somebody to be part of that. So I thank you all for that. And I also thank the museum for the opportunity to speak here, and the Alan Wilson Center, which has just been absolutely phenomenal for my whole trip here, and Glenda and Wendy and everybody at the center for all they've done. So as you heard, I'm going to talk to you about the evolution of goodness. And the way I want to do it is as a kind of adventure tale in science. And like all good adventure tales, this one revolves around a mystery. But it's a bizarre mystery. And the mystery is, why is anything ever good to anything else? Okay. Why? Why should that be, right? If you think about biology, if you think about evolution by natural selection, and just think about Darwin's ideas at their most basic level, Darwin pretty much argued anything that allows organisms to get more stuff, food, mates, safety, whatever, anything that allows you to get more of that should be favored by natural selection. And for most of the time, people think that if you're able to outcompete others to get those things, that should be what we see. And yet, we see acts of goodness, acts of altruism all the time. For evolutionary biologists, when we talk about altruism, we mean something very specific. We mean something that an individual does that's costly to that individual, but benefits others. How do we get the evolution of that kind of behavior? It sounds like exactly the opposite of the sorts of things Darwin proposed should evolve, and yet we see it over and over again. And what I want to do is walk you through some of the history of the topic, including some really remarkable characters that were involved in early arguments about altruism, then bring you up to date on modern theory that evolutionary biologists have, walk you through examples in humans and non-humans, talk about altruism, we'll talk about empathy, we'll talk about the evolution of morality. We'll do all of those things, but let me just start you off with a couple of examples of what I mean by altruism so that we're all on the same page. That is a Belding's ground squirrel, and what it's doing is giving an alarm call. And what's happened is there's something dangerous in the area, a hawk or some sort of terrestrial predator, and some of the individuals, the alarm callers, like this one over here and that one over there, they stand up on their hind legs and they give this alarm call, this piercing alarm call. It's really much louder than what you heard. I just spared you from the high volume. And everybody else runs for safety, underground for the most part. Now, the alarm caller eventually does as well, right? But not for a bit. And there's no doubt, it's common sense, and we also have all sorts of empirical evidence, that if you stand up in the middle of a field and scream at the top of your lungs, you're probably going to be the most likely one to be taken by a predator. So it's a classic example of altruism. You do something that's costly, the alarm call, everybody else gets a benefit. How could that possibly evolve? And the thing about it is, you don't need to be a warm, fuzzy mammal to demonstrate altruism. Remember, we're defining it as something that's costly to do and benefits others. So it turns out you don't need to be a mammal. You don't need to have a brain. You don't even need to have a nervous system to be altruistic. So people, over time, have studied things like altruism in slime mold. Not exactly where you might look, but you'd be mistaken, because they're super altruistic in many ways. So all these little green phosphorescent things, they're individual slime mold cells. So they muck about in the soil, eating things. They're very, very tiny, right? And they just go around as individuals. And eventually what happens is the food in their immediate area is depleted, and they have to go somewhere else to find food. And when they have to go somewhere else, they do this remarkable thing. They form what people refer to as the slug. So this thing right here is thousands, maybe tens of thousands of individual slime mold that have come together into this larger creature that we refer to as the slug stage. They will never be individual cells again. The slug moves around as a respectable multicellular creature. It responds as an entity to environmental cues. And in a sense, this is kind of altruistic. I mean, after all, these individuals have given up independent existence to be part of something that is now a larger organism, in essence. But that's not really where the altruism comes about. What happens eventually is the slug produces reproductive cells. Okay? And it's there that altruism occurs. They produce these things called fruiting bodies. Let me show you what one looks like, and then I'll tell you where the altruism is. So these are fruiting bodies that are emerging up over time. And keep in mind how small the scale we're talking about really is. These guys are tiny. Now, up at the top, right here, for example, is a capsule that's full of the spores. And those are essentially the individuals that will see the next generation. But something bumps into the capsule, a little invertebrate, or maybe even a drop of rain. That's how small these things are. And the capsule bursts open, the spores disperse. So from the slime mold perspective, the higher up you can get your capsule, the better the dispersal. And the way that they get higher up is on these stalks, these scaffolds that are underneath each one of the capsules. Well, all that is a bunch of other slime mold cells. Those cells in the ladder, in the scaffold, they never reproduce. All they do is provide a ladder so that the cells in the capsule, the spores, can start the next generation. And remember, every one of the cells here used to be, at some point, an independent living organism. The cells in the stalk are the altruists. They pay a cost, they don't reproduce, and they provide a benefit. They raise up the reproductive spores high up in the air for a slime mold, and you get dispersed a long distance. So another classic case of altruism. And of course, humans are altruistic all the time. If you think about it, I mean, you know, not necessarily as much as we want, but it happens often enough that we all know examples from our everyday life where you're altruistic, from very simple things like maybe sharing food or giving somebody a little bit of aid, to doing dramatic things like jumping into buildings and saving people's lives. I want to give you one example, and then we'll get to the history and the theory and the modern ideas. I want to give you one example of human altruism that's one of my favorites because it deals with altruism in children. Very, very young children. And it gives you a sense of how ingrained this tendency to be altruistic is. So I'm going to show you a video that was done at the Max Planck Center in Germany. And the video will tell the story, but let me just give you the setup. There's this tiny, cute little kid that's been brought into a room by his mom, and he has no idea what's going on in terms of there being an experiment. But he's just standing there because his mom said, we have to stand in this room and then we're going to go do something else. So he's just standing there. And watch what happens in terms of him displaying goodness. He has no idea who anybody else is here, just his mom, and he has no idea that anything experimental is going on.
Oh. Oh. So?
Okay, so he didn't know who that guy was. You're a little tyke like that guy. You move away from your mom in a foreign environment to do something for this giant guy in a red shirt. That's pretty brave. That requires some. And they did all sorts of controls to demonstrate this really was the child trying to help. But we don't really need the controls at some level. All you got to do is look at the last 3 seconds of that video when he looks up at that guy. And there's no question his intent was to do something to help that guy open up those doors. There's no question about it. We have experimental evidence of it, but all you got to do is look at his face and you know that that's what he's doing. So over and over again, we see this. We see it in slime mold. We see it in humans. We see it in ground squirrels. How could this be? How could natural selection produce this sort of altruistic goodness? So let's walk back in time to The Origin of Species, Darwin's book that laid out major ideas in evolution, right? And in this book, which is beautifully written, I should say, Darwin does something that you rarely see anymore. He spends an inordinate amount of space in the book on problems that he has with his own theory, problems that he has with the theory of evolution by natural selection. And one of the problems that vexed him most was the evolution of altruism. And he focused on altruism in insects, in social insects like these bees, because he knew, and everybody he knew, all his readers would know, that if you get too close to a bee's hive, right, the workers come out and they defend the hive. And in honeybees, they'll defend the hive by stinging you, and when the workers move back after they've stung you, their stinger rips off from their body, and they die. And the stinger stays in you and it keeps pumping in many species of bees. It's the ultimate act of altruism. They commit suicide to defend the hive. And Darwin knew this was a problem. It did not fit into the classic notion of evolution by natural selection. Here's something that not only is it not the case that you're pulling in resources better than others, you're doing the opposite of that. You're helping others by giving up your own life. Darwin wrote in The Origin of Species that this altruism was a special difficulty that he thought was potentially insuperable and fatal to his whole theory of evolution by natural selection. That's how worried he was about it. But eventually, Darwin came up with a theory for how this could evolve by natural selection. And the theory centers on the fact that when a worker stings you or whatever is bugging the hive and is a threat to the hive, they're defending a very, very specific bunch of bees, the bees in the hive. And those bees are their family. They are their blood relatives. Okay? They are what today we would call your genetic relatives. Now, in 1859, Darwin didn't know about genes because Mendel's work was just underway, and in fact, nobody would really have heard of it until about 1900 when it was sort of rediscovered. So Darwin didn't know about genes, but he knew there was something that was passed down from parent to offspring, and that's why offspring look and act like their parents. And he called these things that gemules. Okay? And what Darwin said is, look, all the gemules, what we would call genes essentially today, in the workers who commit suicide are gone, obviously. But tons of copies of those gemules/genes are being saved potentially by the worker in the individuals at the hive. And in particular, the queen in the hive is a baby-producing factory. She's pumping out sister after sister after sister of workers who are committing suicide. And so what Darwin said is, even though the copies of the gemules, what we would call genes today, in the workers are gone, hundreds, maybe thousands of copies of them are being preserved because of the act of the worker. And that would allow natural selection to favor, in this case, suicidal altruism. It doesn't have to be suicidal. It could be something much less than suicidal. But even the extreme forms could be explained in principle by helping your genetic relatives who, by definition, share the same genes you do. So you're helping copies of genes that you have. It just so happens that they reside in the body of others, your genetic relatives. So for Darwin, kinship was the key. Now, about 20 years after Darwin proposed this, there was a dramatic battle about the evolution of altruism that took place between two of the most famous scientists of the day. On the left-hand side is Peter Kropotkin, a Russian scientist, and on the right-hand side is Thomas Henry Huxley, a Victorian scientist, a good friend of Darwin's. And they take diametrically opposed views about the evolution of altruism. And I want to walk you very quickly through this debate because it's an interesting one. It sort of laid the seeds for debates that that are still going on today, and it also involves two remarkable guys. So Thomas Henry Huxley, probably the most famous scientist in England at the time, so we're now in the 1880s, good friend of Darwin, and more than a good friend, Huxley was the voice and the face of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin didn't go and talk to audiences. He wasn't that kind of person, and he was very ill. Huxley was the man who went out and talked about Darwin's ideas, and he loved doing it. To give you a sense of who this guy is, on the night before The Origin of Species was published, Huxley wrote his good friend Darwin, and he and Darwin, of course, knew that there was going to be a firestorm when the book came out. And Huxley's trying to calm him down in his unique way. And he says to Darwin, "As to the curs which will bark and yelp, you must recollect that some of your friends, me, are endowed with an amount of combativeness which may stand you in good stead. I'm sharpening up my claws and beak in readiness, and I'm prepared to go to the stake if requisite." This was a fellow who loved to stand up and talk about these ideas, in part because he knew they were going to revolutionize science, and in part because he liked to tick off his audiences. And he knew that they would be quite perturbed by the implications of this new radical theory of evolution by natural selection. So this is who Huxley is. Now, in the 1880s, Darwin died, and Huxley ended up writing essentially an obituary for him that was part of an article that Huxley published in a magazine called The 19th Century. And this was a very, very popular magazine. It was where ex-prime ministers used to write about politics. It was where Beatrix Potter published her children's stories. It was the place that the intelligentsia turned to for interesting stories. And this is where Huxley publishes his obituary to Darwin. And it's in that where he lays out his ideas on altruism and the evolution of altruism, and in particular, how important kinship was for the evolution of altruism. And Huxley leaves no doubt about his view of altruism. He writes in this article that from the viewpoint of the moralist, the animal world is on about the same level as a gladiator show. The creatures are fairly well treated, set to fight. The strongest, the swiftest, the cunningest live to fight another day. Right? Life is a continuous free fight. And beyond the limited and temporary relations of the family, the Hobbesian war of each against all was the normal state of his existence. The Hobbesian war is this notion that life is short, brutish, and nasty. So what Huxley is doing is he's taking little bits of Darwin's idea, but he's also disagreeing with Darwin. He's disagreeing with Darwin because Huxley thinks that altruism is very rare. Darwin thought it was common. He agrees with Darwin, though, when he says that even though I think altruism should be extremely rare, when it occurs, it should involve the relations of the family, kinship. He thought you shouldn't see it very much, but if you do, it should be among genetic relatives. Now, Peter Kropotkin thought very, very differently about this. And this is a fascinating character. He, too, was one of the most famous scientists of the world at the time. He was also probably the world's most famous anarchist. Now, Kropotkin had royal roots. Technically, he was a prince. And what happened was he was chosen by the Tsar of Russia to be part of a school that would train the next generation of leaders in Russia. And he was such a phenomenally smart guy that at age 16, he was already the best student in the school, and he became the personal page to the Tsar. The personal page. Now, he couldn't give a hoot about the stuff they were teaching him at the academy. What he cared about was two things. He spent his time reading this radical new theory of evolution by natural selection by this British guy named Darwin, and he exchanged letters with his brother about that. And he read all this underground literature on this new political theory of anarchy. So when Kropotkin finished in this school at about age 18 or 19, because he was the best student in the school, the Tsar gave him a choice of any appointment that he wanted in Russia. And to the chagrin of everybody who knew him, he chose to go to Siberia, which had just recently been annexed by Russia. It was a cold wasteland, essentially. Now, Kropotkin wanted to go there because his idols were people like Darwin, he knew Darwin had done the voyage of the Beagle around the Galapagos in South America, and Humboldt, who had also been on these huge natural history expeditions. So Kropotkin thought, I can go to Siberia, and I can study the natural history of animals and in the human populations scattered across Siberia, and I'll be far away from the Tsar. They won't be bothering me. He had a job which was to kind of write about the prisons, which didn't take very much time, and so mostly he was doing a colder, longer version of the voyage of the Beagle. And in his journal, he would talk about lying full length in a sled, wrapped in blankets, fur inside and outside, when it was minus 40 or minus 60 degrees. These dog sleds were how he got around Siberia. And he crisscrossed Siberia over the next 5 years he was there. He crisscrossed it 50,000 miles over 5 years. And everywhere he went, he studied natural history. And he went there with an expectation. He went there with a sort of Victorian Darwin-Huxley expectation of seeing competition. But that's not what he saw. Instead, he saw what we would call altruism and what he called mutual aid. He saw animals sharing food, giving these alarm calls, huddling for warmth. Altruism, 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 everywhere he looked, in non-humans and humans. Later, he would write in a book that he published that was quite popular, wherever I saw animal life in Siberia, I saw mutual aid and mutual support. And it was carried on, it was so common to such an extent that it made me suspect it a feature of the greatest importance for the maintenance of life, the preservation of each species, and its further evolution. What's more, it wasn't just that altruism and mutual aid were everywhere. It was that Kropotkin saw no link to kinship. Yes, individuals were being altruistic to their kin. They were also being altruistic to individuals who weren't their kin. It's hard to imagine two more radically different views. Huxley saying altruism is rare and it should always be tied to kinship. Kropotkin saying it was ubiquitous and there was no link to kinship, right? The thing about this argument, before I finish up the argument, let me also tell you, right, that I mentioned that he was very interested in anarchy. And when he came back from Siberia, he no longer hid his interest in anarchy. He hid it when he was working for the Tsar because, the Tsar was not particularly fond of anarchists. But when he came back, he became a public face of the anarchist movement. He was fascinated by anarchy. He was so fascinated because, for him, his work on mutual aid and evolution and his interest in the politics of anarchy very, very quickly became one and the same thing. And here's why. Because anarchists essentially argue that government is the problem rather than the solution. That if you let people live in small groups and you don't enforce governmental regulations on them, they'll be cooperative and good to one another. And what Kropotkin saw in Siberia was something interesting. He was very mathematical, and he began to notice these patterns where the further a Siberian peasant village was from the seat of government, the more mutual aid he saw. The closer a Siberian village was to the seat of government, the less mutual aid he saw. Right? Government was the problem, not the solution. And the work on mutual aid in animals provided a biological justification for anarchy because, look, there's no government in animals. You let them live in small to medium-sized groups, and he thought they would naturally cooperate with each other. And so the two things became very, very quickly entwined for Peter. Now, the Tsar had enough of his old friend, and he issued an arrest warrant. The secret police caught Kropotkin. They tossed him in the nastiest place around, the Peter and Paul prison in St. Petersburg, where they threw all of the people they really wanted to keep away from everybody else. Kropotkin was stuck in there for 2 years. He was the only prisoner that was allowed paper and pencil because the scientific community insisted that even if you're going to lock him up, you got to let him write his science. And so the Tsar did. But eventually, Kropotkin and his friends decided to try and escape. And their plan at first was that this was in St. Petersburg, and on the outside of it, there were always these vendors who sold red balloons to kids. And the idea was that one of Kropotkin's plants on the outside would let a red balloon go, and he and his buddies would use that as a marker that this is when they should try to escape. Didn't work. They didn't have red balloons the day they were supposed to escape, so they replanned it, and they decided that they would have somebody on the outside who would have a violin. And when the person on the outside played the violin, and particularly when they played a mazurka on the violin, they would make a break for it. And so when Kropotkin heard that music, he ran, bolted over the gate, cut his beard off, shaved, worked his way out of Russia to Finland to Sweden, and then finally over to England, where he got into the debate with Huxley. Okay? The thing about their argument was that it set the stage for arguments that are still going on today, but really, when they had it, it was a philosophical argument. None of these guys were doing experiments. None of them were developing theory. They were basically explaining the way they saw the world through their own experiences and coming to diametrically opposed views about how evolution works in terms of, is kinship important for altruism? How common is altruism? But it wasn't really, it was more of a philosophical than a scientific argument. To get to the real hardcore science, we have to jump forward past some other incredible characters that I hate skipping, but we have to move 100 years forward to 1963 and the birth of the modern theories for the evolution of altruism, in particular, the evolution of altruism and how important kinship is. And in 1963, this fellow, Bill Hamilton, came up with the first mathematical theory for the evolution of altruism. Hamilton was arguably the most important evolutionary biologist since Darwin, and his most fundamental contribution was about altruism. And he developed his mathematical model when he was a graduate student in England. And Hamilton basically said the following. He presented it in two ways. One was this sort of long, dry, boring 50-page paper with dozens of equations. And the other was a very crisp 3-page paper in which he boiled all those equations down to three simple variables that you need to keep track of. And if you can keep track of those things, you can predict whether altruism will evolve. So let's kind of walk through Hamilton's model. So the three things that Hamilton says you need to keep track of and measure are the genetic relatedness between individuals. So it's not enough anymore to say that kinship is the key. You need to have a measurement of the exact genetic relatedness between individuals. Between Darwin's time and Hamilton's time, mathematical evolutionary folks had built these tables where they calculated the genetic relatedness between siblings, between cousins, between parents and offspring. So the tables were available for you if you knew what the relationships were. Most of the time, you got the relationships by doing family trees, right? You would go out, and if you were studying these ground squirrels, you would go out year after year after year. You would mark the animals. You would know who is who. And over the years, you would begin to know, OK, this individual is that individual's mother. This individual is that individual's cousin, and so on. And then you could just look up what their genetic relatedness was. And it's between 0 and 1. 0 meaning no relatedness, 1 meaning identical twins, and 1/2 meaning siblings and other genetic relatives. And cousins are 1/8, and so on. You can look it up on the charts. Hamilton said you need to know what that is. Then he said you need, and nowadays we can do this with molecular genetic techniques. We don't necessarily have to go out into the field the way that people did before, although it's still very useful. Second thing he said you needed to know was the cost of the altruistic behavior. It's not enough anymore to say, yeah, the alarm caller pays a cost. Now you need to measure that cost. Think about our alarm caller here. We want to know something like, are you 10% more likely to be taken by a predator if you give the alarm call than if you don't? Are you 10 times more likely? What's the cost? Measure it. Go out, measure it. Then Hamilton said the third thing you need is a measurement of the benefit associated with altruism. So how much does the individual who's helped really get? It's not enough anymore to say, you get helped. Now you have to quantify what that amount of help is, the benefit that you get if someone is altruistic towards you. Again, let's think about our ground squirrel. Here's one that's popped its head up now that it's safe. This is someone who didn't give the alarm call. They're just underground. They come back up. Now, they got a benefit, no question about it. Let's measure that. Let's do things like ask, what's the probability of being taken by a predator if you're in a group that has alarm callers versus a group that doesn't have alarm callers? You can measure your probability of survival in those different situations, and you can quantify the cost, the benefit of altruism, how much you get when you're helped. And Hamilton said if you know these three things, you can plug them into a handy-dandy simple equation and predict whether altruism will evolve. And Hamilton's model goes like this. If you want to know if altruism evolves, you take the genetic relatedness between the individual who's helping and who's being helped. You multiply that by how much the individual who's helped gets. And if those two things multiplied by each other are greater than the cost of altruism, then altruism evolves. And the model really boils down to this. There's this cost that we're now measuring to altruism. Virtually every evolutionary model that has a cost associated with it has some compensating benefit. Otherwise, we don't really have good models for how something that's only costly but doesn't have compensating benefits evolves. We don't really have those models. In Hamilton's model, the cost of altruism is paid back by the indirect benefits that altruists get by helping their genetic relatives. So think about it like that, like this. When you help your relatives, they, by definition, are genetically similar to you. So you get some indirect kickback from whatever benefit they get when you're altruistic to them. So you take the benefit they get, but you don't get that full benefit because you're not them. You're just their genetic relative, which means there's some probability that you share the same genes. What's that probability? It's the genetic relatedness. So you take the benefit and you multiply it, you devalue it by genetic relatedness. If genetic relatedness is high, then you don't devalue it that much. And if genetic relatedness is low, then you devalue it more. But you multiply these things, and if it's greater than the cost of altruism, altruism evolves. It's like you're getting this indirect genetic kickback for every relative you help. This idea is known as Hamilton's rule. And it's very easy to take this idea and expand it. in the following way. When you're altruistic, sometimes you may be only altruistic towards a single individual, maybe a single relative. But a lot of times, if you're giving alarm calls, for instance, you can help lots of genetic relatives. And for everyone you help, you get the genetic relatedness you have towards them times how much they got. So if you help 10 relatives, then you get this for every single one of them. But the cost of giving an alarm call is just the cost. It doesn't change. So the more relatives you help, the more likely altruism is to evolve. So this is the first mathematical model for the evolution of altruism via kinship. So let's take a look at the kinds of things people did to test this. First, we'll talk about an animal example. Then we'll talk about a human example. So one last time, the ground squirrels. Okay, just because we now know something about ground squirrels, and this was one of the first studies done, and it's really a classic. So the first thing I'll show you is the only graph in the talk, which is going to show you, if you have a ground squirrel group, what does it look like? And all this graph is saying is that about 30% of the group is made up of adult females, and about 20% is made up of adult males. And let's just focus on the adults, because they're really where the action is. Okay? 30% are adult females, 20% are adult males. Now, over here is the proportion of alarm calls given as a function of what group you're in. Look at this. Adult females make up 30%. But they're wonderful. They give 65 to 70% of the alarm calls, way more a proportion of the alarm calls than they make up the group. They're very, very altruistic. Males are rotten, filthy scum. They're 20% of the group, and they give almost no alarm calls. Why? Why should that be? Why should females be the one giving the alarm calls? Well, the answer deals with kinship. But to see how it works, you need to know one more tidbit about ground squirrel life. In ground squirrel populations, when individuals reach sexual maturity, males leave the group they're in, and they go to another group and they find a mate. Females stay in the population where they were born, and they mate with some male who comes in to their group. Okay, now what that does is it sets up a very different world in terms of genetic relatives if you're a male or a female. If you're a male and you go off somewhere else and you find a female and you mate with her, the only relatives in your group are going to be the few kids you have. But if you're a female and you stay in your birth population and you mate, right, then you're surrounded by not only your kids, but potentially your mother, maybe your grandmother, because these things live long enough for that to happen, your sisters, your female cousins, your aunts. You're surrounded by genetic relatives. Who gives the calls? Females. Who's surrounded by genetic relatives? Females. Who don't give calls? Males. Who's not surrounded by genetic relatives? Males. Kinship is the key. And what's more, there are a few instances where females had to leave their groups because their habitat got destroyed. A few instances happen like that. Now, all of a sudden, they find themselves in the same kind of world that males typically do. They're no longer surrounded by their genetic relatives. They stop giving calls. They act like rotten males. Okay? So there's good evidence that kinship drives this system. Now, let me give you an example of the way people study this and the importance of kinship in humans and human altruism. Now, this has been studied in all sorts of ways. In the field, for example, in natural situations, if you want to sort of know how individuals are going to line up in alliances, you need to know blood pedigrees. Individuals, when they're going to take risks, tend to ally themselves with their kin. You give them the choice as to who they want to help with resources, money, food, whatever. They preferentially go to kin. Over and over again, we see a preference for helping kin. But it gets more interesting than that. If you think about Hamilton's model, yeah, it's true that the simplest prediction is you should help close relatives more often than you should help distant relatives, because your close relatives carry more of the same genes. So you get more of this indirect kickback if you help them. But it gets more interesting when it gets more complicated. So it turns out that not all relatives are created equal in every sense of the word, and not, just in biologically and in terms of your personal experiences at dinner and all of that sort of thing. So here, what we're going to do is look at something interesting about the way that kinship is structured biologically. Kinship that runs through females is more certain than kinship that runs through males. And it's due to a simple biological fact. You're a female, you give birth to a child, you're 100% certain that child is yours. You're a male, and you're never 100% certain that that child is yours, right? You may be pretty certain, you may be not so certain, but you're never 100% certain. That means that for any given relative, be they a cousin or whatever, if you're related to them through the female side, there's a higher probability that they're actually your genetic relatives than if you are related to them through a male side. So that means we would predict that for the same level of relatedness, by terms like cousins, for example, cousins that are related through females should show more altruism than those that are related through males. So let's look at that. People did this experiment in the laboratory, and they brought in a bunch of people, a bunch of subjects, right? And they gave them the following scenario. Some of them were given the choice to provide some assistance, some help, some aid, some resource to their cousins. And they were given a scenario in which cousins were related to each other through two females. You in the dark and your cousin in the light. Your mother and your cousin's mother are sisters. So your relatedness to them goes, you can be connected to them essentially two ways through these two relatives. Both of them are females. So there's two female lineages here. So we expect to see lots of altruism there relative to everything else. On the other end of the spectrum, you and your cousin could be related because your dad and your cousin's dad are brothers. You're still cousins, but now you're linked to your cousin through two male lineages. And so the prediction would be the least amount of altruism here. You're still going to get altruism, but not nearly as much as we predict, not nearly as much as over here. And in the middle are the two other scenarios. In each of the two middle ones, you and your cousin have one, you're connected through one male lineage and one female lineage. Either your mother and your cousin's father were siblings, or your father and your cousin's mother were siblings. So you're connected to your cousin in the middle by one female link and one male link. So we expect something intermediate here. You run the experiment, you give them the opportunity to give some resource, be altruistic to individuals in these scenarios, and lo and behold, you're more willing to, you give more resources to these cousins as a function of how many female links there are. The more you're related through females, the more altruism you're willing to dispense. Now, we're not silly enough to think that subjects in this experiment that are just drawn from the population are sitting down calculating their genetic relatedness to their cousins, nor are they sitting down and devaluing that genetic relatedness by the number of males or females. Of course they're not doing that. It's not happening at a conscious level. But it's happening. I mean, the results are very clear. What this suggests is that the human psyche has evolved to be very, very cognizant about cues of genetic relatedness. And we make these subtle distinctions between relatives at something of a subconscious level because our brain has evolved in a world over time where genetic relatedness was really important. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about other ways that evolutionary biologists think that altruism could evolve. We've been focusing on kinship, but there's another path, and that is altruism can evolve when acts of goodness are exchanged, when there's some kind of reciprocal altruism, some sort of system of reciprocity. Here the argument goes like this. If an individual is undertaking some altruistic act, that kind of behavior can evolve if there's a high probability that individuals that you help at a cost to yourself, they will help you when you need it. Now here, again, the cost that you're paying is compensated, but it's compensated differently than in the kinship model where it was just because you share genes. Here the idea is you pay a cost to help somebody, and later on they repay that cost. And typically, the cost you pay to help somebody might be fairly small, but can have a dramatic effect on the individual you help. And later, when you need it, the cost they have to pay can be small, but it can really be important to you. I think about, for example, throwing a life preserver over a boat. Yeah, it's possible that the person will pull you so hard that you drown, but the odds are pretty low that that'll happen. So a small cost to you, the small chance that something happens to you, provides a huge benefit to that person. And later, if they reciprocate, then that cost can be compensated. So this is one way that evolutionary biologists think altruism could evolve. I'm going to show you an example of reciprocity in one of my favorite creatures, vampire bats. So this guy right here is a vampire bat, and he does what vampire bats do. Maybe it's a she, I'm not sure. They go around and they suck blood from things, not humans very often, although occasionally, but not that often. They're basically hooking onto cows in fields and getting blood meals. That's their nutrient, is blood. Now, mammals aren't really designed to fly for the most part, and flying is extraordinarily expensive compared to running or walking. And you need a lot of energy. So much so that a vampire bat who doesn't get a blood meal about every day or two has a high probability of starving to death. So what do they do if they're hungry and they're close to starving to death? Let me show you a video that answers that, and then we'll talk about how this is a good example of reciprocity. This is a video where you hear David Attenborough briefly narrating what happens inside a vampire bat roost, where you might have 10 or 15 or 20 bats.
Friend. She turns to her neighbor and licks her face repeatedly, begging for food. If she goes hungry for more than a day or two, she will die. But her friend regurgitates enough life-giving blood to keep her going until the following day.
Okay, so what's happening here is you got a scenario where there's a really hungry bat, and there's a bat that's got a stomach full of blood. And it's very easy to tell who has a stomach full of blood. Their guts are literally distended out. Okay, so what happens? Well, the hungry bat goes over and she licks the face of the bat that has a blood meal. And if she's lucky, the fed bat will stick its fangs into your mouth, regurgitate a blood meal, and save you from starving to death. But there's only some probability that she's going to do it, that she's going to help you. What determines that probability is whether or not you helped her when she needed the blood. They keep track of one another, and they exchange acts of goodness, which in this case, I just love the fact that the act of goodness is, vomiting blood into your friend's mouth. But it really matters. It really matters. You'll starve to death if this doesn't happen. Okay, so for the last part of the talk, I want to actually kind of move even further into the realm of goodness and kind of move past. Okay, so we know now from an evolutionary perspective that you get cooperation and altruism in humans, you get it in non-humans. Kinship is important, reciprocity is important. Maybe there are lots of other things in the realm of goodness that we can study from an evolutionary perspective as well. And I want to talk to you about one of them, which is empathy. Okay? And empathy generally is defined as the ability to take the perspective of another individual, and if they're in distress, doing something to reduce their distress. So if you help somebody because you feel what they're feeling, then you're being empathetic. Now, I don't want to get too much into the costs and benefits of it. Really what you're doing is, one way to think about it is it's a very selfish act in some ways. You feel the pain that they're feeling, and to reduce that, you help them, which then makes you not feel the pain. But that doesn't matter for what I'm going to talk about. The point is, you can take their perspective and you do something that helps them. Yes, it helps you too, but you don't have to do it. You don't have to do it. And it requires pretty sophisticated cognitive machinery to take the perspective of another individual who's in distress and help them. Let me show you one of the few really good examples we have of empathy in non-humans and how it works. And it deals with our friend the rat. Okay? And here's the experiment. I'll show you a video in 1 second, but let me just set you up. The way it works is there are two rats. One of them is trapped in a canister, and it's perfectly alive and it's perfectly alive in there and doing fine, but the door is locked in a way that the trapped animal cannot get out. There's another rat that can roam around freely. And it could, in principle, open the door. So the door can be opened from the outside, but not the inside. Okay? The rat on the inside is giving off these ultrasonic distress calls. It's hard to figure out how to open the door if you're the rat on the outside. And it's not clear why you would do it. All you're doing, potentially, is opening the door and letting someone else out who might want more food, who might take food, who might do all sorts of things. But let's see what happens.
So we put a free rat, the rat with the black dot on his head, into an arena, and in the center is his cage mate trapped in a plexiglass restrainer. The door to the restrainer can only be opened from the outside by the free rat. Here you're seeing the first 5 minutes sped up on the first day of testing. Even though it takes quite a bit of rat courage to venture into the scary arena center, the free rat persists in moving to the center and trying to figure this restrainer thing out so he can help his cage mate. So now in this clip, the rats have been in this paradigm several times. This is the 5th day of testing. And we're viewing the session in real time, but after 25 minutes have elapsed. What you see is that the free rat is very focused on the door. You will see him open the door for the first time in a moment. What I want you to notice is that the free rat freezes. He freezes because the door falls over, and since it's the first time he's opened the door, he's surprised and he startles by freezing at the sound of the falling door. There he goes.
There it is.
Now, after a brief exploration of the strange land of the restrainer, the liberated rat runs around exploring the arena. Wherever the liberated rat goes, the free rat follows, jumping on and licking him. For about 5 to 10 minutes, this apparent celebration continues, with the free rat very active and always in close proximity to his liberated cage mate.
Okay, so I'm going to guess that's the first time you've seen empathetic rat celebrations. And those aren't my words. I'm not sure I would use those. But here's what we know, okay? These rats, they had lived together for 2 weeks before one of them was stuck in the canister, but they were not relatives. They only knew each other for 2 weeks. Furthermore, it took the rat with the black dot 5 days. It's hard to figure out how to open that door. It took him 5 days. But every day after this, they kept putting this pair back together. And those days afterwards, he opened the door very quickly. So it wasn't that he just did it the first day. He did it all the days, or almost all the days afterwards, and very quickly once he figured out how to do it. So what's going on here? Well, they ran a bunch of other experiments to see what other things might explain this besides empathy, besides the notion that the rat on the outside was responding to the distress that his friend was suffering in there, and finally figured out how to let him go out, and then consistently do that whenever they were together. So they ran some control experiments, right? And they ran the same experiment as I just showed you, but now there was no rat in there. So the argument here was maybe, rats are really curious, and maybe they just kind of wanted to figure out how to open the door, and they really couldn't give a hoot that there was somebody else in there. They just wanted to figure out how to open the door because it's kind of boring running around this thing all the time, and they were interested. No rat in there, they don't care. They don't spend time trying to figure out how to open the door, and they don't. They don't open the door. Put a toy rat in there, something that looks exactly like your friend, but doesn't do what rats in canisters should do. Again, no interest in the canister, doesn't open the door, never learns it. Now, researchers here thought, well, one possibility here is we're giving these rats way too much credit for being empathetic. The empathetic argument is the rat frees his friend, the rat frees the other rat, his friend. See, I'm already talking empathy. He frees the other rat because the other rat is giving distress calls, and the free rat the rat on the outside wants to reduce the pain, the distress that the other individual is going through. But here's an alternative explanation. The rat on the outside just wants someone to play with, and they like being together. And they went through that apparent celebration. So maybe all you're trying to do is maybe you don't give a hoot about the distress that this other animal's in. You simply want to play buddy. So what they did was they ran this experiment, but this time, once the rat on the outside figured out how to open the door up, right, every day as soon as it opened the door, the rat that was in the canister was immediately taken out by the investigator. And these rats are smart. They learned how to open the door, for goodness sake. So they learn things very quickly. The rat that was on the outside opening the door learned that once I open that door, I'm not going to get a chance to play with that other individual because this strange hand is going to come down and take it out of the cage every day. And yet, day after day, they opened the door and freed the individual in there. Seems like empathy. Next, they decided, well, let's let's try and figure out if we can calculate, if we can somehow gauge how much of a reward a rat gets for doing this, for being empathetic. How much, I don't know, pleasure, joy, I'm not sure what the word is, do you get if you free another rat? To do this, they ran a nifty little experiment. Rats love chocolate. They'll do anything for chocolate. Okay? So here's what the investigators did. They have a rat on the outside, and they have a rat trapped in here. And there's another canister that has a lock door, and that canister has a bunch of chocolate chips in it. Okay? So what does the rat on the outside do? So maybe I was wrong to call him selfish before, because a selfish, respectable rat would, at worst, he would go over and open the chocolate, and then, let me see. If he was completely selfish, he would open the chocolate, eat it, and leave his buddy trapped, right? Okay. Or maybe he would go over and eat the chocolate first, and then free his buddy, okay? What do they do? In fact, what they do is they free their buddy, then they open up the canister with the chocolate, and then the two of them eat the chocolate together. Now, isn't that touching? Doesn't that warm your heart that the rats would do that? But this really demonstrates, again, that the rat on the outside was truly getting some reward for this, right? Because they'll do anything for chocolate. And yet, rather than just take the chocolate and run, they free their partner first, then they share the chocolate with them. So somehow they're being compensated for that by the pleasure that they're getting from freeing their friend. All right, one last example in animals, and then we'll wrap up with one quick human example, and we'll be done. Let's take a look. So, well, if they're empathetic and they're altruistic and they show mutual aid, maybe there's more we can study about the evolution of goodness. Maybe we can study morality and fairness. So I'm going to show you a very, very now famous experiment on morality and fairness that deals with capuchin monkeys that you see. Here's one, here's another. And I'm going to let the narrator, Franz de Waal, it was his work, and Sarah Brosnan right here, they did this experiment together. I'll let him tell the story, but I just want to give you one bit of information that's really important. The way this experiment was set up was they had trained the capuchin monkeys to learn that if the capuchin took a stone that was in their cage and they handed it to Sarah, that Sarah would give them a piece of food. That's actually pretty cool in and of itself that they learned that. But the more interesting thing was they learned that they might get one of two kinds of food, and they don't know which one. They just know if they hand their stone to Sarah, they're going to get a piece of food, and it could be a piece of cucumber, or it could be a grape. And they're perfectly happy with cucumbers and grapes, but they have a preference for grapes. If you give them the choice, they choose grapes. So they'll eat cucumbers, but they really, really like grapes. Now, let's look at a video that shows you the response to inequality, a simple measure of fairness in capuchin monkeys.
Is a monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. Oh. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens.
Okay.
So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it.
Happy
the other one
rock.
needs to give a rock to us.
Okay.
And that's what she does.
Right.
And she gets a grape.
A grape.
And she eats it. The other one sees that.
She sees it.
She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
So there you have it.
So this is basically the...
This is a response to inequality. Keep in mind that they like both those foods perfectly well. But that rock, that stone, does not have intrinsic value, an inherent value. It has a value in relation to what others get for it as well as what you should get for it, right? So it's not fair. You did the same thing as the monkey next to you, and they got the good stuff, and you got a cucumber. And the thing about it is, capuchins, like most monkeys, you give them food. They don't give it back. It's very hard to get food back from a monkey. Not only do they give it back, there's no question that that monkey was very, very upset. I mean, they were shaking the bars. They were throwing the food. And again, this is not an isolated incident. Over and over again, Franz saw this stuff. It's a response to inequality. OK, so let's finish up. 2 minutes now. One last bit on humans. So now we have evolutionary ideas on empathy and in response to injustice and altruism and mutual aid. And we've now moved on with respect to the studies on humans. And we actually now are studying things like the genetics of altruism in humans and what goes on inside the brains of people when they're being cooperative and altruistic. And this work I'm going to show you deals with work from a fairly new discipline known as neuroeconomics. So let me tell you what neuroeconomists do. They take what psychologists have been doing for 40 years. Okay? And what psychologists have been doing for 40 years is they bring people into the laboratory and they give them some sort of test of how much they're willing to sort of cooperate with one another. So a classic experiment might be something like, 5 people come into the lab and they're each given $10. And they're told, you can keep your $10 and walk away. Or you could take half of it and throw it into like a communal pot in the middle. And if enough individuals, let's say half of the individuals in your group put money into the communal pot, we're going to give you 4 times as much money as you started with. But if they don't, if enough individuals don't throw into that communal pot, then you lose the money you threw in the communal pot. So you have to be willing to take the chance that other people are going to be altruistic and contribute to the communal pot. Okay? So that's what psychologists do. What neuroeconomists do is they run the same kind of experiment, except they scan your brain while you're doing it. And they scan your brain in an fMRI or a PET scanner. So here's a basic setup. Don't worry about the details. There are 2 people in the study. One of them is comfortably sitting in front of a computer, and one of them has their head in an fMRI machine having their brain scanned. Both of them, through fancy mirrors and projection systems, see a kind of setup over here that tells them how much money they will get and the other individual will get, depending upon what they do. So basically, what they're learning is this. If they hit the green button, so they've been through this a lot, and they've learned the rules of the game before they get stuck in one of these machines. They've learned that if they hit the green button, that's the equivalent of demonstrating you want to cooperate. If you hit the red button, it means you don't want to cooperate. Okay? And you know what's going to happen under all the scenarios. You've learned what will happen if you both cooperate, what will happen if you both don't cooperate, and what will happen if one of you do and the other one doesn't. Now, the way this game is set up, if both players hit the green button and signal they want to cooperate, then they'll each get $2. And the total amount of money is $4. That's the total amount of money can be. That's the maximum that 2 of you together can get. $2 each, $4 in total. But the most money that a player could get would be if they hit the cheat button and their partner hit the cooperate button. Then they would get $3. So the maximal individual payoff comes from cheating if the other partner cooperates. The maximal group payoff, the $4, comes if you both cooperate. So they run these people through this experiment, right? And this is just what I told you before. And they simply, when they're done, they ask people, so what made you feel best? What outcome made you feel best? And people will overwhelmingly tell you that the outcome that made them feel best was when they cooperated and the other individual cooperated, and they got a total of $4. They got $2 each. That made them feel best, even though they could get more money if they cheated and their partner cooperated. They say they felt best, but people say all sorts of things. And what we want to know is more than that. So you look at the brain scans, right? You look at their brain scans, and here's what happens. When people are in a situation where they and the other player cooperate, the one where they said they feel the best, even though they don't get the most money, they feel the best, they said, well, you look at their brain scans, and what you're seeing down is sort of a view from on top, sliced through. I mean, they're not really sliced through, but they're just electronically showing you what it looks like. And the red and yellow areas are the areas where there is the most activity in the brain, where the brain essentially lights up. This is what the brains look like when they're in this mutual cooperation outcome, the one that they said makes them feel best. Well, it turns out they were probably telling the truth, because these lit up areas, these are some of the reward centers in the brain. These are the areas that light up when you put someone in an fMRI machine and you give them chocolate, or when you put them in an FRI machine and you give them anything that we know produces a reward. Those same areas light up when they're in the mutual cooperation scenario. They feel good, literally, and we can look inside their brain and infer that they're, in fact, are feeling good, because the same, they respond like they do when they get chocolate or sex. That the parts of the brain that light up are the same parts of the brain. Then they ran a nifty little follow-up experiment. And it's pretty much the same as this, except they added something to the end of it. So you go through this, right, and sometimes your partner cheats. And so now the investigators say, we're going to give you another chance here. If you want to, we're going to charge you for it, $1, $2 of the money we give you. We're going to charge you for it, but if you want to pay that, you can punish the guy who just cheated on you, okay? And we'll take more money back from him than we take from you. Right? And people overwhelmingly jump at that opportunity. They want to do it. And, importantly, the same areas of the brain, the reward centers, light up. We enjoy punishing people who break the rules. We can now use these scans to really get deep down in terms of what's going on when people are displaying altruism, what's going on when people are responding to people who break rules, and so on. So to sum it up, I would say that where we are now is this. We have these theories on kinship and reciprocity that help us explain altruism in non-humans and humans. We're using work from evolution to understand empathy, injustice, and responses to injustice in both humans and non-humans. We're now looking inside people's brains when they're displaying various kinds of pro-social behavior. I didn't get to it, we don't have time, but we are actually now beginning to identify clusters of genes that seem to be linked to the tendency to be cooperative and altruistic in humans. And so the hope is that we have a long way to go. There's still a good chunk of human altruism that we don't have a good answer for, but we've made tremendous progress, more than I think Darwin might have expected us to make. And the long-term goal here is not just to understand this as biologists, but to take this sort of thing and use it, or give it to people who can use it to make the world a better place. And I thank you for giving me the chance to tell you a little bit about this, and I'm happy to take questions and chat with you afterwards. Thank you very much for the chance.